I was in Lowe's Foods today in the produce section, and I came across this apple. Look at the size of this thing. This is a Honeycrisp apple as big as a toddler's head. I thought I just had to have it. When I was growing up, I spent a ton of time with my grandparents. They lived less than a mile from our house, and we called them Mama Duck and Papa Duck, but that's a story for another day. They always had lots of great food at their house. But more than anything else, they always had great fruit. My granddad, Papa Doug, he owned a produce stand in downtown Charlotte. And, then when he decided to retire, he actually loved interacting with people and produce so much that he decided to go and work for the farmer's market. And so every day when he would finish work, he would bring home the best of the best of what was unsold in fruit and produce. And so I can remember as a little kid going over to Papa Duck and Mama Duck's house, and he would have the juiciest oranges. He would cut a little hole in the middle of it, and then we would squeeze it and have the fresh squeezed orange juice shotgun right into our mouth. Then he would take apples like this, and he would pull out his, case knife, little pocket knife, little yellow knife that he had, or he would pull out his Barlow knife, and then he would just start to cut. And unlike me, he would be able to go around the entire apple and peel off the entire rind, making just one corkscrew. It was awesome. I loved it growing up. It was so much fun to go to Papa Doug's house and see what kind of fruit that he had. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 6, verses 15 through 23 tells us that all of our lives have a kind of fruit that we are measured by. We start out in bondage to sin. In fact, Paul calls us slaves of sin. We don't even get to choose whether or not we give in. We're born into sin. It's part of our nature. You don't have to teach a kid how to do wrong things. It's just part of us. It's built into our DNA. And as we continue through life, the default mode for every person is that we're slaves to sin. And the fruit that comes from that kind of slavery to sin, Paul says, is death. But on the other hand, the Apostle Paul says that for those who have been saved by Jesus Christ, we're no longer slaves to sin. Now we are slaves of righteousness. Jesus has rescued us from the penalty and the power of sin, and now we bear a different kind of fruit in our lives. The fruit that we have in our lives now is fruit that leads to make us more like Jesus every single day, and the fruit that ends with life that lasts forever and ever. The Apostle Paul tells the believers there in Rome that when they wake up every day, they have this choice, but it's not the choice that some of them thought they had. It's not a choice to wake up every day and say, well, today I'm either going to be a slave to sin or a slave to God. That wasn't their choice. The Bible tells us in Romans 6 that if you know Jesus, you're no longer a slave to sin. Even if you give in to temptation, even if a sin keeps tripping you up as a believer, you can no longer be a slave to any sin. It doesn't have any power over you except what you willingly give it. Instead, Paul says you're automatically every day a slave to Jesus and a slave to righteousness because you've been changed and you have new fruit that's a part of your life. Paul said there is a choice every single day for believers when they wake up, but it's not, am I going to be a slave to sin or a slave to God? Here's the choice that Paul wanted every believer to know they had each day when they wake up. And it was this: am I going to be an instrument in the hand of God that produces lots of fruit? Or am I going to be an instrument that even though I've been set free from the power and the penalty of sin, I choose to obey it when I don't have to? The choice isn't, am I going to be a slave to sin or a slave to God? We're servants of God. That's your identity. But the choice is, am I going to be an instrument that God uses to produce lots of fruit and I live like somebody who's been set free? Or am I going to live like somebody who's still dead in their sins and be an instrument that doesn't produce much fruit for God. In your community groups today, you're going to have a chance to look at this passage a little bit more, Romans 6:15 through 23. And so if you're not in a community group, you can just get together with your family members, with some coworkers around a lunch break, or maybe some friends that you invite over. And you can just download the discussion guide to go deeper with each verse in this passage. You can download that in a link below. But today, I want you to remember, if you are in Jesus Christ, you're no longer a slave to sin. You're a servant of God, and He's called you to produce much fruit.